Right, so good morning, everybody. Right, ManySecured. I think it's important to emphasize one of the design differences about ManySecured. So, ManySecured, it's all about what can you do about security at the gateway level? And the reason it's framed like that architecturally is because it's an honest recognition that there's a lot of insecure devices already out there. So it's all very well to come up with new technologies, new architectures, new processes that are future-proofing things going forward, that require sort of like, new tech to be introduced at the actual physical IoT device level. But, facts are facts. There's devices out there. The churn rate on some of those is going to be extremely low. And so you need some form of mitigating mechanism to, if not remove the risk, then at least reduce it. So this is the sort of like the high-level conceptual architecture that we talked about on Tuesday. So I'll just go over some of the basics just again and briefly, because we're going to be coming back to this and again. So fundamentally, what we're trying to do is we're trying to describe the problem. The consumer IoT rollouts are real. So how do we cluster those sort of like physical architectural elements such that we can analyze it effectively from a security perspective? So the heart of it is sort of like this, the IoT device here. So these are IP devices, webcams, speakers, etc. They all, certainly in the consumer sense, generally sit behind the consumer firewall, the router here, and have a physical interface, which is the IP interface. And that's the core of what it is. But we also got to recognize these devices do have other physical interfaces. They're all not the same, but some of them have Bluetooth devices, some of them have USB devices. So what we're doing when we're putting this dotted line is we're sort of essentially creating a conceptual cluster of devices. Obviously, these aren't all identical, but they share properties from a physical connectivity perspective, which then obviously also translates to a security exposure interface. So this is our first sort of class of IoT devices. Then we, for quite a while now, used this distinction between IP and non-IP devices. So non-IP devices are the ones that generally run on battery. Because they run on battery, they need to be very careful with their energy usage. Because they need to be careful of their energy usage, they use sort of like optimized networking protocols. And because they're using optimized networking protocols, they typically don't use an IP protocol, which is really important from a security perspective, because you've got many physical over-the-air interfaces here of various security qualities. Now we've got the mainstream ones, Zigbee, Z-Wave, sort of like Bluetooth LE, etc. But I was quite amused actually to see the recent Amazon announcement, and that they're starting to roll out LoRa for the consumer device as well, which is interesting because we've been looking at that for quite a while ourselves, just because, to be blunt, it works better. Now, if you've got a protocol, if you've got these non-IP devices, you need conceptually, you need another physical device on the system, something we call a protocol bridge. It's got to physically manage the translation between these complex and varied wireless connections, and somehow translate that to IP such that it can be moved sort of like up the system. And we'll talk in a little bit more detail about the lines in a second. But there has to be a translation service, because obviously raw Zigbee or Bluetooth is not going all the way into the cloud. You've got two classes of devices here we call user apps. So we make like big coarse distinction. You've got local user apps and you've got remote user apps. What is the difference? Local user app, you're firing your application up at home on your PC, laptop, or whatever, and it's making a physical local connection. It doesn't need the internet. There's sort of like peer-to-peer connections happening here, and it's allowing you as the user to gain some utility over these IoT devices. But you've got also remote user apps. They sit outside on the internet, also provide this function. But if you look at the bits and the bytes, they're going a different route. They're flying up into the through the router into the cloud. Now, the interesting thing is you can be sat on your sofa controlling your speaker system or your lighting system or your heating system, and you can flip between those two use cases almost instantaneously in some cases, just by your Wi-Fi going out of reach. Because you jump off Wi-Fi and go to 4G. Okay, you haven't moved, your user experience hasn't really shifted, but the bits have suddenly gone a completely different route. And I think that's an interesting area to explore in a minute. Next cluster we've got is, well, let's look at this one, is the router itself. So the router is there's a lot of stuff going on in there. All highly relevant from a security perspective, but it's your gateway to the big wide world, and it's through this that these devices become IoT devices and not just little local smart consumer electronics. That is the big difference. And so there's a whole host of standard IP gubbins, from DHCP, DNS firewall modems, etc., that happens here. And then another interesting complexifying factor is this class of devices we call the network extenders. So what they do practically is when you've got a Victorian house with thick walls or a multi-story house, they allow the bits and bytes to still get to the outside world because this Wi-Fi just ain't strong enough to get there. So very real problem. There's loads of them in PC worlds. There's different technologies to do it. And there's different ways of configuring it, which creates different network topologies. And again, the interesting thing is what is the implications from a security perspective when you introduce these?
Nick, it's Duncan here. Sorry,
sure.
We've got a couple of questions coming.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
There was a question, I think, from Andrew Neal. It says, what's the distinction between Bluetooth in the box and the IBT as an interface? So if you look, for example, in the non-IP, you've got kind of Bluetooth, there's a box in the big box, and then you've got IBT. Could you just clarify that?
Okay, not a perfect distinction, but I suppose principally, so there are examples of devices that may use IP, they may use Z-Wave, they may use Bluetooth, but let's exclude Bluetooth. So they may use an alternative networking technology for their daily comms, but they use a Bluetooth interface for what we call some of them administrative management functions. So I think if you look through thread specs, you'll see some of this stuff. You'll see Bluetooth being used as a provisioning mechanism, which is quite interesting. So I think what will help make this distinction a little bit clearer, and maybe we can refine the diagrams to crystallize this, is on each of these links, there are coarse-grained two flavors connections You've got, we call, in the other diagram I showed, what we call the F interfaces, functional interfaces. So this is the day-to-day bits and bytes get flown about the network that provide continuous IoT function. It's your TV streaming, your speaker working, your thermostats receiving information. But then you've got a whole new conceptual characteristic of messages that we call the management interfaces, the M interface, that's happening only occasionally. It's doing they're doing privileged functions. They're configuring the device. They're doing firmware updates, etc. And going back to the thread example at the moment, in that particular scenario, the BT is used for the Bootstrap provisioning flow before it actually goes sort of like day to day. So that's the reason that the Bluetooth sort of on that box there exists in the two places. You'll see the BT also existing on every one of the interfaces, and that's just to manifest the reality that for a reasonable number of physical sort of like IoT devices, Bluetooth is supported.
So I think just pick up on Andrew Neal's comment or question. He says, so functional are the ones on the sides and management are the ones on the bottom of the box? Question mark?
No, yeah. So I tried to simplify the diagram from the one previous day. It's probably made it more complicated. Not always. so I mean, what I'm saying is that it's sort of a crude layered architecture. This is just, if there's a box on the side of the physical thing, it's a physical connection can be made there. Whether something's like a management message or a functional interface, it really depends on implementation. I do get the point. I think what's confused things here is there is a little bit of redundancy here. So on a future variance the diagram, I'll try and clean that up. But hopefully I've got the basic message across.
Okay, well, let's move on.
Excellent. So yeah, I was talking about the network extenders. Yeah, and I say when you dig into the detail of this, it can get quite complicated because, you know, is it running a completely separate network? Is it a subnet? Is it got its own DHCP server? Have you overridden the DNS settings, etc.? These are, you know, a simple configuration setting completely changed the security dynamic. And then we've got what's sort of like happening once we get out in the big wide world, and we've crudely divvied up it into the cloud services, which are things that sit there and run for a long time, and then the user apps, which are, you know, more sort of like ephemeral. You know, you start them up, you shut them down. But I'll go into a little bit more of that in a minute. But again, I just want to reiterate, this is a conceptual architecture. When you really dig into the detail, you can see, you know, interesting phenomena. So take my favorite example of an Echo Plus. So the difference between an Echo and an Echo Plus, you know, from when you're ordering off the website, it's not very much. When you look at it from an implementation security perspective, it's quite interesting. So we count voice apps as a local user app because they sort of like run locally down here. But an Echo Plus is also a speaker. It's providing a utilitarian function. And in fact, sometimes I use my Echo speaker through my Bluetooth. It's like I use it as a dumb speaker. So I connect my Echo Plus speaker through Bluetooth, through my phone to use it. But actually, an Echo Plus also contains a Zigbee interface, and as we found out recently, soon to also include a LoRa interface. So the Echo Plus is also acting in the role of a protocol bridge. So you've got to see these boxes more sort of like as roles, and you can have one device playing the part of different roles at different times. But so the reason we've sort of like spent a long time developing this, and again, it's not going to pretend it's perfect, but it's our current best efforts, is, you know, the enemy of good security is A, poor conceptualization, and B, which then obviously leads to poor communication. The crisper we can get this in terms of understanding and also being able to communicate it, the better and the more effective our mitigations will be. And so two little hobby horses of mine, I mean, you know, words like authenticate and words like trust, people love using them in security documents, but, you know, these are technical terms. And if you want to really understand it, you've really got to qualify every time a word like that is used, what's being authenticated against what and for what purpose and for how long. Similarly, you know, same for the notion of trust. If you just start dropping these words into sort of like documents without this fine-grained qualification, you can end up jumping over a lot of detail and then leaving a lot of security holes. And when we're just trying to apply that methodology to the work that we're doing, we find we need to reference something like the diagram that you saw on the other screen. And that is fundamentally what it's there for. And hopefully it at least moves the dial a little bit forward in doing that. Let's sort of like talk about four use cases for connecting an IoT device, so we can see how these abstractions work in practice. So here's the first one, right? Let's use a webcam. It's an IoT device. You know, you take it home, you open the box. Let's jump over the magic of how it connects to the internet, and it zooms up and calls home. So there's a cloud service, and it can do that because the IP address or the common name of the address is embedded in the device. And, you know, the minute you turn it off, the bits and the bytes go all the way into cloud, and it can start talking and be useful. And it actually is quite a good, useful model because, you know, any remote user app or even a local user app can actually connect to that quite meaningfully, quite quickly, quite easily. And it does have some relatively known security properties, especially when you compare it to the alternatives in a minute. So that's one use case. So here's another use case, which is, this is more the bulb and the light switch. So, you know, again, there's got to be a bootstrapping problem, which I'm deliberately skipping over. I'm talking about how is it working day to day once you've got over that magic. But, you know, day to day, what's going to happen is the physical light switch is talking to a bulb. So, you know, elements of this device type are reflexively, you know, going around a loop via some mediation method back to each other. That's the second use case. So here's a third one, which is you need something like a protocol bridge to do it. And I'll explain why in a minute. You turn the device on, and then it connects to something locally. It's not going out here. It's not connected to the internet. It's connecting to something that it knows is sort of like in your house and is reliably there. And it can't be this thing, because this thing's dumb and stateless. It just passes bits and bytes through. And the closest thing we have to these devices at the moment are what I crudely put in the classification of protocol bridges, the Google Homes and the smart things, etc. And the reason this is a good and reliable thing is it's always on. So this protocol bridge has an interesting quality which is different to the applications. It's essentially a server. User apps, certainly a browser, you can't guarantee is already there. It's totally stateless. The user apps you can turn on or off. You can shut your computer down. You can turn your Wi-Fi off on your mobile, and then these apps are are suddenly disabled. So they're not reliable. They're not reliable devices to which you can connect. Therefore, if you want to create a device that's reliably doing things, right, it needs somewhere to go. And basically, there's only two places it can go. It can reliably go to cloud-based systems, or it can reliably go to local-based systems. And so this is introduced as a new sort of like concept. And then the final one is the local user app. So this is the example of Spotify connecting to my speaker, or possibly my diabetes monitoring app on my phone connecting to my sort of like diabetic IoT enabled health device. What you're seeing here hopefully is useful, because it's clearly demonstrating what I think are the four major use cases. There are some more subtle and nuanced ones as well, but instantly from a security perspective, you can see each and every one of these has quite distinct qualities, both in terms of the data that's being moved around and obviously the security consequences thereof. Right, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. As I said earlier, we jumped over the Bootstrap problem. So let's have a look at that now. So one of my favorite little hobbies at the moment is working out how many different ways can I, after opening the box on my webcam, make it functional. And when I mean functional, I'm talking lowest level of function, actually it's not sending anywhere, just physically getting on the network. Now I've got my SSID here, with my sort of like username and password. So how many different ways can I connect that device? So I think I've got 10 so far. So I'll just talk them through. So this first one, actually, the last one I bought, QR codes. Quite interesting. So only webcam can do this. It's an out-of-band method. And it's a two-way. I can't remember the exact specifics, but basically you get a mobile phone, there's a QR code on the actual physical webcam device. Yes, QR code on the webcam device, the phone reads it, the phone knows what your Wi-Fi connection is, or might even ask you to enter it again, depending on what level of privilege it's got. And then it generates a new QR code, which you then show to the camera. And only cameras can do this, because as an IoT devices, because cameras have got sort of can process that QR code. But what that does, end result of that, then the camera's connected to your Wi-Fi. That's method one. Method two is quite, I like this one quite a lot. And I've seen this one quite recently. It's really irritating. It just squeaks it. Because some of the webcams have got mics and the speakers. And so what the mobile phone, which obviously has some, provisioning knowledge, is where you're actually entering your Wi-Fi credentials, or where sucking it from, it transmits it again out of band, using what amounts to old school sort of modem squeaks. So two methods of provisioning, both out of band. One's audio channel, one's a visual channel. So you could have a USB connection, you plug it in, you attach it to the PC. It's a bit old school, but that does work. You do see it. And then also, and this sort of like goes back to the question we asked earlier, Bluetooth. Sometimes the webcam will support Bluetooth, not because it's using it functionally, and it's not even using it for the management interface. It's actually just using it for provisioning. Because obviously it's another relatively reliable out-of-bound channel that most people are used to understanding. And there you go, you've basically some crossed over. Like, similar, same to the USB, but different is the RJ45 connection. So if you've got an RJ45 connection, you can plug that on the network, and then you've got that mechanism of connecting. Then we've got WPS buttons. Some of them have that. That's another way of syncing your. Here's one that's actually relatively common. And actually I've introduced a second physical interface here, because you've got your Wi-Fi chip. And you can have a Wi-Fi chip, and you can have it in client mode, you can have it in AP mode. So some webcams will have a custom AP interface. You then have to change your Wi-Fi settings in your phone to actually physically connect to the webcam device. Then the app, you have some sort of like little bit of handshaking. You pass over the credentials to the Wi-Fi that you want to connect to, and then the Wi-Fi client connects to it. It's quite common. It's horrible user experience. I personally think that it is done quite a lot. Wi-Fi Direct's got some soft app stuff, which I think, if it works properly, is quite cool. Essentially, what it's doing is it's creating a sort of guest Wi-Fi network that's reliable, relatively unqualified, relying on you providing the physical method of connection between your provisioning device, which is your mobile phone, and your IoT device. That you can pass over the data, and then it can connect. And this is one of my favorites. I think it's a Texas Instrument PAN protected stuff, but found it by accident the other day. I've seen this happen. Some devices actually encode your Wi-Fi credentials in the length of the encrypted packets. And then obviously another device which doesn't have the credentials to access that Wi-Fi device, it can't get on it, it can't see what the packets are, but it can see the packets and see how big they are. So it looks at the length of the packets and decodes the length of the credentials. And then it often takes a while for it to do, because it's a very unreliable method of communication. But once it's gathered enough information, it then attempts to actually connect over that method. I think that's my 10. I missed out NFC. I think this is interesting. This is the real user experience of commissioning an IP-based IoT device, and it's incredibly diverse. And each and every one of those has got very different security implications, because you're essentially using an out-of-band method of passing in some quite privileged information, and how easy it is to sniff that. So hopefully that was somewhat instructive. But then that brings us on to another question, which is perimeters and security perimeters. Naively, you could say, okay, my wireless LAN username and password, it's mine, it's my secret, and then once I give that secret to a device, I've trusted it. And there are a lot of systems that I suppose implicitly make that assumption. But you've got to ask yourself, is that a reliable assumption to make? Do you really trust the fact that only things you have permissioned really have access to those credentials? How easy it is to sort of like spoof your way on there? I mean, and practically, when it comes to individual users, now, how many people do you share those Wi-Fi credentials with, and how many people do your children share those Wi-Fi credentials for? That's actually a very, very common factor. But then the second issue is actually these new devices that you have implicitly wireless permission, can you really trust them? Can you really? I mean, the very fact that IoTSF Foundation exists almost implies you can't. So it is not safe to say that passing over wireless connections is sufficient to grant trust to everything on there. And in fact, I remember I was the guy talking before me on Tuesday was talking about the Singaporean security trust architecture, and he was making a big thing about zero trust. So this is essentially a manifestation of zero trust, which is basically don't just make coarse-grained perimeter decisions on trust and qualify each sort of like connection and each relationship separately. So I bring this up because of twofold. One, obviously, we implicitly talked about one security perimeter. and one privilege, which is essentially writing SSID and PWUs. But I think throughout this discussion, and just throughout the analysis of IT security generally, you need to constantly think back to what is your security perimeter. And there are different levels of it. I mean, you've got the physical one, right? We're classic corporate, well, not classic, tiny little SME, but we've got two Wi-Fis, two physically different Wi-Fi systems, the guest one and the corporate one. That's one way of segmenting. But then a lot of Wi-Fi systems have double SSID, so you can port two SSIDs on one physical device. That's another way of doing it. Then, on one shared SSID client, you can create new subnets, and that's an approach we've looked at quite a lot recently, which is essentially segmenting at the IP level. But then even on one IP level, you can start looking at the peer-to-peer sessions and methods of binding devices. So 3-4 different layers of perimeter types. Then it's not a complete list, but you mentally, when you're thinking about these sort of problems, you've got to constantly go back and thinking, which one am I using? Where am I talking in this stack? We're still really just talking about the Bootstrap problem now. How do I get my Wi-Fi connected? We're talking about going on the Wi-Fi and the 11 different methods we've got for doing that. That just gets me on the Wi-Fi. I then need to connect to it. So how do I do that? Now there are different methods, but to be honest, probably the standard one is some form of rendezvous bonjour MDNS. That is pretty much de facto standard of how does application A find device B on an internal network. I've never really liked MDNS. It seems to be sort of unreliable, but it certainly is not great from a security perspective. But reality is that is the way a lot of it's done at the moment. I think it's just worth bearing that in mind, because it has knock-on effects as you start to think up the stack in terms of what's going to happen next. My personal preference is, we start to think about something a little bit more secure for that essential phase in the level. We've really now only got up. We're looking this is just the provisioning piece here. We've only really got to the point now where an app or protocol bridge or server has found the device. So how do we do the authentication bit? What credentials? What information is available for us to do that? And there are at least 3 dimensions to consider here. There are more, but we've got to keep things relatively simple because the complexity explodes very rapidly. There's user identities. Who am I as a person? How have I authenticated against what have I authenticated? There's device identities, which this is you, the physical thing, that specific device I bought from that specific shop that I can specifically put in the bin. And then there's the device type identities, which is basically a quality of that physical device, which is who manufactured it, whose firmware is it running, all that type of stuff. And when we're creating these bindings, there's a number of ways that it sort of just slipping levels a minute in terms of what authentication stroke authorization credentials do I provide to say a particular binding now needs to happen. And the current ETSI standards and guidelines talk a lot about passwords. I think we need to, passwords we need to be quite careful about. As we start looking at the detail, all passwords are not equal. You've got device passwords, which are, passwords that we're using essentially to authorize to a device. I don't really think that's authenticated. You've got passwords that are using ephemerally as almost like binding tokens. So these are really qualities of the device itself. But then you've got qualities of the users. You've got remote user passwords. That's relatively easy. These are our classic. This is our cloud password, our Google password, our sort of Amazon password, etc. But then we've got local user passwords. For example, have I cached maybe some of the credentials for a cloud password, or have I got a significant and sensible model for doing these having multiple users on the local system. And then, as I say, you've got to think about passwords as authentication versus permission. But So sort of following on from the application connections, it's probably worth looking at what are the different ways we can actually exchange passwords. First example is what I call the application flow. So let's go back to our webcam. We bought a webcam, we've got it at home, we opened a box, we now need to connect to it. We might have connected over IP, we might have connected over Bluetooth, but that's just allowing us to see each other. We can route a packet between A and B. We now need to pass some form of authentication between A and B. And so one method of doing it is basically you have an app, and you create an app that, it can have an MDNS client, it can discover the device itself, and then once it's done that, there is a password that's, I don't know, okay, yes, it's not, it is unique. So we tick that box. But then there's a method via which that password is then passed from the app to the device, and that becomes the authenticating event. And it's possibly to do that relatively reliably in an encrypted fashion, such that the password cannot be spoofed. Fine, we can do that because we can have the sort of like end-to-end encryption implicit in the app itself. There's a downside to this method, though. And the downside to this method is you basically almost need a new app for every different device, every type of device that you bought, or certainly every manufacturer that you bought. It's quite difficult to have a common one. But the next one is the cloud flow. And actually, so this is there's some bad things about this method, but it's relatively secure. So the webcam, you open the box, you turn it on, you bootstrap it onto the Wi-Fi network, it can talk to the big wide world, it goes to your cloud service. I open up my my web app, which is like universal. I don't need a separate app now for every single device. I can go to my cloud service, and that essentially acts as a rendezvous point. And then we've got a secure connection from here to here, secure connection from here to here, and we can pass through whatever authenticating sort of token user authorization we like over that secure channel, and it's fine. But the downside is, you've got no internet, it don't work. You can't bootstrap yourself if your internet's down. And I think we need to think carefully: is that a requirement or not? So these new protocol bridges. So one of the reasons they're sort of appealing is they introduce a new flow. In this instance, and again, this is almost the real world experience of what users who are using. The Amazon and the Apple and the Google ecosystems. So you've got this device you bought, you've put it in your home, and then these both apps and devices can make, in most cases, relatively reliable connections between here. And that may or may not have an internet dependency. And the devil's really in the detail here. And it comes down to whether, as a user, and this is why I haven't made it very good to explain this, a real strong distinction between what I call real user authentication and just essential local authorization tokens. A real user authentication means, I'm me, Nick's probably only got a finite number of passwords. Usually it's in the cloud. And the question is, has that protocol bridge been able to cache those credentials? Because if it can't, then I've introduced an internet dependency to that authorization flow. But, and this is my big bugbear at the moment, and I keep going on about it, and I want someone to tell me that I don't have to worry about it. But the reality is, the way it really happens at the moment is you get your device, and it encourages you to open a browser and go to the IP address. But the harsh reality is that it's very hard to make that connection both secure and usable. You can't issue easy to use HTTPS certificates for locally hosted devices. I've not found anyone doing it. If anyone doesn't believe me, I can show you some examples. Someone can explain to me that it's not an issue, I'd be really happy. But this is one of my biggest bugbears at the moment, because it does, to some extent, make a mockery of the non-unique default policy password, because those passwords are going around in the clear on the internal network. And it's a lot worse than that. I've said this before, because it's not just this leg here. The routers have the same quality, and the network extenders almost always have the same quality. And I think this is something as an industry we need to be doing something about with a reasonable degree of urgency. So yeah, I mean, specifically, let's look at this, the XC provision. Authentication methods shall use best practice cryptographic to pass those passwords. Here's my problem. I just don't know what best practice is in this instance. I know what real practice is, and it's this. But if you want to do it from a web user app, and there's good reasons for doing a web user app. It's usable. I don't need a new app for every new binding that I'm creating or every device I'm creating.
Right. Nick, yeah? So just to interrupt you, there's been a question, or Hannes has said he doesn't understand what the challenge is, right? About why it's a problem, right?
Right. Can you see on my screen? I anticipated this question. Like TP link, yeah. So I'm physically here in the office. This is the switch. It's a decent switch. These are the ports that are exposed, right? So let's go. This is the standard one I'll go to. This is how I manage it. Right? See that there? It's not secure. Right? I put that username and password in. Any reasonable method of attack can see that password. Any other device, any user on my system with a moderate level of sophistication can see that password. So huge, in my mind, security issue. Now, I'll go back to my thing. You might have noticed this one exists. So that some people are hosting HTTPS connections. Let's click on that one. Now, what's the problem? This is why it's not usable. So technically, I can host a certificate, but that's not a valid certificate, right? Because a valid certificate needs a common name. That's not a common name. That's an IP address. So this is the paradox. That one is not, well, it's telling you it's not secure, but it's not flagging it. This one is secure, but the user experience is telling you it's not secure. I mean, literally, that is what it's showing you. And that is what I see as the problem. If people are aware of methods of solving this, I would be very interested. But I know categorically, just go home, look at your own network, go to PC World, buy devices, and you will see this again and again and again. So even if there is a good solution that's both usable and secure and interoperable, it's definitely not being used wholesale at the moment. So if we accept the fact passwords are difficult on local networks, how about something a bit stronger? How about some certificate-based options? So they exist, they do. None of them are mainstream yet, I'd say, in terms of they're not deployed widely. And there's a whole host of stuff here, various level of complexity, and I won't pretend to understand them all in detail. They do all, to some extent, address the problem that we're talking about. But I mean, it's going to be interesting to see sort of like which of these win in the big wide world. I mean, crudely, you've got, so the FIDO Alliance is doing some interesting stuff. Actually, drafts in the public domain, looking at certificate-based security, so sort of like right across the full sort of like life cycle. I'd advise you to go and have a look at that if you're interested. I think some good work going on there. Not finished yet, I don't think, but it's evolving. Zigbee, OpenThread, Weave all do some of this, or have some level of. Basically, a lot of the ways this works in reality, there's a certificate exchange, peer-to-peer certificate exchange. A certificate exchange is going to happen under the hood, and it has to be, there has to be some form of authorization event, whether it's a sort of like a password token or some agreement on sort of like root key exchanges, etc. That's all of that stuff. And as you've seen in the news, there's this new Connected Home IP consortium where all the big guys have sort of like come together and sort of like try to align for solutions. So there's something happening in this area. There's Bootstrap. I think Michael Richardson's talking after me on 2 sessions after. So he's the expert in this area. IoTSF have done some good stuff in terms of sort of like key exchange, sort of like permissioned methods. also addressing this problem. Also by the ITF, you've got the remote attestation. So I mean, that's looking at certificates, but I mean, as I'll explain in a minute, certificates are certificates. Great. They have some good, strong underlying security primitives, but what does it mean? And the thing is, what the RAT stuff is doing is really looking at how do you authenticate the device type largely? How do you attest to how do you remotely attest to the integrity of the physical device? And there's some interesting sort of like parallels between what RATs are doing and what FIDO9s are doing. So the other stuff, W3C and the distributed identity forum. So W3C is doing a lot of work on SSI and verified credentials. Most of the work they're doing at the moment is really looking at user identity, not device identity, but the crypto primitives are general purpose. The other thing of noting, the DIF and the SSI, they really talk about distributed ledger all the time. It's just because those are the people that seem to be driving it. The tech there is good and solid. It is not dependent on distributed ledger. I don't know what your personal opinions are on it. I'm not a great fan myself, especially not for these type of applications. But don't sort of dismiss the activity that they're doing there just because they talk about DLT a lot. The underlying sort of like crypto primitives are very, very generic. And specifically, I'd recommend have a look at Occam. So Occam's a new company come on the market. Again, they're DLT based, but what they're doing is they're using some of the SSI verified credentials for doing device identity and device type identity, which I believe is key. So there's as you can tell, I'm running out of time already, and I haven't even got onto the bulk of what ManySecured is doing. So I don't have time to go anywhere near the level of detail here. But there's good stuff around in this type of area. In terms of how do you certificate and token based methods for addressing this, but you really need to look in the detail of the syntax, semantic setups and flows to understand how is it used, and especially with reference back to some of the flows that we were talking about earlier. So that's stuff that's going on. But I mean, what is a perfect system? What do we want? Because what we want will determine the size and the shape of the sort of enhanced security mechanisms that we're going to have for, device-based security and peer-to-peer security. So I personally, and I think last time I saw Michael's presentation on the Boosie stuff, I think he agreed with the same. There shouldn't be an internet dependency. It should be possible to bootstrap your device onto the network without calling out to the cloud. And why? I think it's just practical and usable. But it's a lot harder, I can tell you that, when you actually try and implement it. But so that's one of the requirements to think about. Second one is, okay, this is the dirty sort of like little secret behind a lot of certificate-based methodologies, is that a lot of them do have sort of a root certificate-based architecture. And the minute you do that, you confer commercial advantage to certain organizations. So you need to look very carefully about what your root certs are in any possible sort of like rollout. And this is actually one of the reasons I personally quite like the stuff that's been doing in W3C with the verified credential stuff, because it's using a different model that's not based on root certificates, but still shares some of the same security properties.
Nick, it's Duncan here. We're going to run complete out of time. I know, but actually I thought it's worth, Hannes has come up with a question, which I thought...
Sure, no problem. I'd rather go slowly, bit in detail, rather than just skip over that stuff.
Right. And there's lots of good stuff coming up, but I can't capture it all. But I thought this was key. And it comes back to your first point here. And he's wondering, why do you want no dependency on the Internet of Things for an Internet of Things device? Yeah.
Good question. I think that I don't want dependency on the bootstrap. Because I mean, so Michael's example is I'm setting it up in the cellar, and it's just physically in that very early stage of me just getting the binding there, that last leg's not connected. And secondly, I mean, I think, I mean, it's a good question, and it's worth trying to justify whether the assumption we're making is incorrect or not. But the second The second requirement is there's an implicit assumption that if you're going out to the cloud, you know where to go. And if you know where to go, you're talking about a locked-in commercial ecosystem. I quite like the idea of buying my webcam, bringing it home, provisioning it on my network, using it with the ecosystem of my choosing, which might be local. I might just want to do local edge-based processing and have all that set up without any dependency on a cloud-based entity. So there's two levels of answer to that question. One, physical. There are just some scenarios where, I don't know, I want to get everything running, and BT or Virgin's not come around and set my internet up yet, but I still want to. I don't want to be stymied by that. That's just sort of like logistical provisioning. But then the other one is a bit sort of deeper and darker, which is, okay, once you accept that you need intent provisioning, then it tends to push you towards methods that have very strong commercial ecosystem bias. And I'm a very strong proponent of open systems and user control and all that good stuff. So hopefully that will partly answer that question.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Right.
Okay. I'll go a bit faster. Non-IP devices. Fairly straightforward. I talked about it a bit before. How do all of these talk to these? Yeah, these are there's lots and lots of different lines. But it introduces some interesting design questions about what do you want these protocol bridges to do. If you ever want them to do edge-based processing, you need encrypt, decrypt, store, encrypt, decrypt. It's a two-leg thing. If you don't want to do edge-based processing, you can have encrypt, or store pass-through. So there's some interesting design requirements around protocol bridges that impact how it's implemented and the security qualities thereof. And local edge processing and local edge function is a key one. And just to sort of like flash in on the NLPs, I put in Zigbee and Z-Wave and Bluetooth and LoRa, but I mean, there's loads more. I mean, I just picked up the Open Hab. It's one of the most common sort of like multi-capability IoT routers. There are so many industrial or old school proprietary interfaces out there that are outside of those mainstream, and I don't think we should neglect those. And especially we can't neglect them as ManySecured, because we very much want to look at the legacy problem, because we think it's the interesting and the very real problem. And I'll throw this one in that new announcement I intimated before, that stuff about the sidewalk thing. Amazon, they've introduced the new LoRa capability in the protocol bridges, because it introduces two concepts at once. It's obviously a new physical interface that has some qualities, but then it's introduced this issue of partitioning, because obviously the way that it's worked is your protocol bridge, your hub, has created a separate partition both here and up to the cloud. So it's providing, it's not that dissimilar to the BT Wi-Fi guest networks that they've sort of like shoehorned into BT hubs. So but you've got a new physical piece of tech, like a new physical wireless tech, LoRa, which has got some great sort of like functional qualities, but then a partitioned network, which again is interesting from a security perspective. Blah, blah, right, partitioning. Right, so we're starting to move on to a little bit more about actually some of the real world ManySecured features that we're sort of like looking to address. But, partitioning, I think, is definitely a use case. There's, again, I've mentioned this before, the Internet of Things Security Foundation work talks about the need to partition the IoT device from the local user apps. So how do you do that? And I think what I'll do is to give enough time for questions. I'll sort of finish on this bit on the summary and then leave it.
Are you going to move to the gateway, Nick?
Fundamentally, what we're doing in ManySecured is we're introducing a new concept, a new architectural element. So we think it probably resides pretty close to the router. And it does, it's doing a lot of the things that I intimated the protocol bridge does. But a lot of the big challenges that we talked about that we need to address for to enhance the security, we need this local secure capability for, and that's a lot of the the fundamental sort of like development work that we're doing. So there's a load of work about underlying foundations. So this is very much about the keys, where are the keys stored. This one is the stuff I was banging on about for ages in terms of the local secure connections and what are the syntax and semantics of the secure communication method. So this is, and you know, so this one the router needs to support. This one you can make a very strong argument. This new gateway component is essential to deliver. Updates, right? We know updates are important, but how? You know, there's a fundamental challenge: is how do I know I need one? And I think the gateway has an essential role to play in terms of understanding what the device is, and then knowing whether it is due an update or not. And 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are all basically various methods of how do I segment the network or control the network based against either what are the properties of the underlying device, which I can see, and or the more advanced stuff is what is its behavior. And I think, and the interesting thing here is to do both the updates and this smart control based upon sort of like what is the device. You need device type identity. So what is the device I'm talking to? And there's various types of this. There's what we call weak type identity, and you'll see that in the thing, which is based upon MAC address. I'd say MUD, manufacturer user description, which is an IoTSF spec, does a form of weak type identity. I call it weak because it's spoofable, and certainly in its current form. But it has the potential to be strengthened, but in its current form, it's a weak. Another weak device type identity, you can delegate that problem to the protocol bridge. And the stronger types are based upon certificates, so anything from the chip to the FIDO to the RATs, etc. So these are a much stronger one. But, and then I think I'll just sort of finish on this because I think it really gets to the heart of what ManySecured is. But what about all the legacy devices? So for all the legacy devices, you can't do all this because this all requires you changing stuff. You know, your new devices have to comply. You know, we need to use either inferred type identity. This is where sort of magical AI bits come in, or user declared on provision. So actually, you know, when you provision, you add in new flows where the user can say, I think it's this device. But once you've got that, and once you can persist that, then you can really add a lot more features and functions to address the underlying security specs. So basic conclusions, what we're doing is got to, you know, we're looking at future-proofing stuff, but it's also the legacy. It's a legacy problem that's the real one. Loads of people are looking at the future stuff, but how do you stop the real problems already out there? And this is where the gateway's got a real important role to play. And hopefully I've done my best to explain what the size and the shape of some of those problems are. There's lots of activity on the future stuff, but I think the legacy stuff is where we need to follow up. And then in terms of following up, you know, to continue this conversation, because it is a conversation. Obviously, you can make contact through the ManySecured website. There's lots of sort of like publications coming up very shortly that will go into a lot more detail on this, and then we will be creating sort of like communities on that website where we can sort of like continue this dialogue. And in the interim, obviously, we can have some questions now, but I'm quite happy to take anything offline via email or other methods. Right.
Okay, Nick, thank you very much. I just want to say this has generated a lot of interesting questions, a lot of debate. I'm sure some people disagree with you on various points, and it's going to generate a good discussion. So I think you've just sort of wound some people up, which is good, which is the you know, what we wanted to do today. I will say that we will be setting up, the IoT Security Foundation will be setting up a special interest group to take this further and give you a conduit to have this discussion. And so we do want people to join that special interest group because these are real issues that need tackling. And I thought it was quite interesting comment from Ian, which I'll probably finish on, which is who will have, and it's the last question for you, Nick, who will have the commercial incentive to supply and maintain a gateway that provides these functions? Will it need to be mandated? So we could probably have a long discussion on that.
I think I can answer it really simple. If it is true that we can insulate the security risk, then anyone currently providing existing routers, network extenders, or protocol bridges will have a strong incentive to add these capabilities in. If some of my assumptions are wrong, I mean, the point is they don't all have to, there's so many features we talked about, they don't actually all have to hold true for there still to be value. But I mean, you can invert that question, which is says, who has the commercial motivation to release an insecure router?